morning and welcome to the first webinar of 2018 from the Secretariat of Child and Youth Protection. My name is Melanie Takinen and I am the Associate Director for the Secretariat. Today's webinar will focus on the topic of diocesan review boards, including recommendations on how to best utilize your own review board. Before we begin, let us pray. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Holy Spirit, comforter of hearts, heal your people's wounds and transform brokenness into wholeness. Grant us the courage and wisdom, humility and grace to act with justice. Breathe wisdom into our prayers and labors. Grant that all harmed by abuse may find peace and justice. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
As we will be discussing the topic of review boards today, I want to highlight that all diocesan review boards do things a little differently, and there's no one best or only way to run a review board. So our presenters today include 3 members of the National Review Board who also serve on their individual diocesan review boards. They are here today to share with you some of their own experiences and opinions, as well as give you some ideas of things to consider for your own review board. If at any time you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box and we will go over them toward the end of the presentation. So we have with us today Judge Kate Huffman from the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, Howard Healy from the Diocese of Green Bay, and Ernie Stark from the Diocese of Joliet. Thank you all so much for being here with us today to share some important information regarding review boards that's really helpful for anyone in the field of child protection know, even those of you who may not directly be serving on a review board. So Ernie, I will now turn it over to you to lead us off in the presentation.
Thank you, Melanie, and good morning. As we entered this morning, this headquarters of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C., there was a display, and part of it was a pinwheel display. Does that bring back playful memories from childhood? It did for me. Although aside of this pinwheel garden, there was also a large crucifix, and on it there were pictures with names and ages of youngsters who had been sexually abused. The playfulness and innocence of childhood, which the pinwheel symbolized, was taken from them. And I was struck by the ages of these victims, 7, 9, 14. And it filled me with a certain sadness and a certain realization of how important our gathering is this morning as we talk about review boards. As Melanie indicated, we'll talk about diocesan review boards, and we'll also talk a little bit about religious community review boards. This day, data indicates that there will be 800 children sexually abused in our country. And that's published data, 800 children. These are the ones who tell. That's a horrible figure, isn't it? And we're grateful to you to take this time out because the 3 of us are convinced that participation in review boards is an important step in the church struggling to create safe environments for children. Hopefully today those children who are abused, this will not happen to them in ministries or places of our Catholic Church. They will not be abused by any member of our faith community, and certainly not by members of the clergy. You know, society in general has been slow, I think you could say, to become aware of the depth and the height of sexual abuse, child sexual abuse. Slow to understand it. I think that's going on in our society. And I think our church in the United States was slow to realize the ravages of child sexual abuse. As the crisis, as we refer to it, became more and more public, the bishops in our country did deepen their awareness, their understanding of this horrible, horrible scourge. And in 2002, there was kind of an apex reached with the publication of a document called the Charter for the Protection of Children and Young People. And that became, in the history of our faith community's battle against sexual abuse, kind of a foundational document If you think of the United States and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in the United States, this charter has become a foundational document and a companion piece called the Essential Norms, and we'll be referring to those things this morning. Now, incidentally, those documents do face revision from time to time. One is undergoing right now. But in 2002, as I said, this was kind of an apex point that was reached. Incidentally, shortly after 2002, the religious communities in the United States published a document called Instruments of Hope and Healing. Now, the reason for that is religious communities enjoy a different culture and are bound by different canonical structures than diocesan priests. So think of diocesan priests, those men who go to the seminary, return to dioceses, take a promise to their bishop, diocesan priest. Different canonical structures as those men who join religious orders, Franciscans and Benedictines and Jesuits and Dominicans. They become members of those orders first and then are ordained. And to take into consideration their different status, their culture, the communities of men published Instruments of Hope and Healing. And we'll talk a little bit about those. You'll notice on the screen that under that is called the Presidium Standards. And that's something that I hope to mention in these initial remarks. But let me go on and just talk for a minute about the charter, because certainly that's something as review board members, as prospective review board members, you must be thoroughly familiar with. And the charter itself can be summarized by saying it's a statement of intent. It starts out with I consider a very moving admission by the bishops that there were mistakes in dealing with the crisis of sexual abuse in our church, with an apology, if you will, and with a stated commitment to move into the future, dealing forthrightly with this terrible phenomenon, if you will. Now, the charter has four main emphases. One, to promote healing and reconciliation, and you'll notice that of the 17 articles, the first three have to do with healing and reconciliation. This was truly a step forward, to put victims first, to acknowledge that they have been harmed, and to do what is necessary to heal them and to reconcile them. A second theme of the charter, to guarantee an effective response. Each diocese is required to have procedures and protocol to deal with allegations. Civil authorities must be reported to. And it's here in the charter that it says that review boards shall be created. Every religious community, every province of a religious community has a review board. Every diocese shall have a review board. You'll notice that in Articles 8 through 11, there's an emphasis on to ensure the accountability of our procedures. And then fourthly, to protect the faithful in the future. Now, in addition to some of the specifics I have mentioned that flesh out these articles of the charter, the bishops created a secretariat for child and youth protection. That's here in Washington, an office that will assist dioceses in safe environment programs, that will see that an annual audit is being done of dioceses so that the promises made, the intentions stated in the charter are fulfilled. And perhaps we can talk more about that later as our time together unfolds. That there should be safe environment programs for children, the importance of background checks for all working with children. So some of these are the elements of the charter. National Review Board was created. The bishops, among their standing committees, now have a committee on child and youth protection.
One thing I quickly want to emphasize that you mentioned, Ernie, too, is that the charter was a foundational document. I think so often, sometimes the question is, well, why isn't the charter more specific? Why doesn't it tell us more of exactly how we should run a review board or add in, certain programs? But really the idea was the charter should give that initial foundation so dioceses can continue to build upon it for their own victim outreach, child protection, and review boards. So that was a great point of the foundation of the charter. Thank you.
And that it's ongoing, continuing to
Yes.
revise. But if you will, if I could use this analogy, Melanie, it's kind of the sacred scripture of the church's efforts to create safe environments for children. Let me mention just something about the essential norms, which I said was a companion document. You've got the charter, 17 articles. These are the things we promise to do, the bishops say at the end of that. Promise to do to create safe environments for children, for young adults, for youth, I should say, children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Those who, by reason of physical or developmental disability, cannot protect themselves from child abuse. Now, the companion piece, called the essential norms, to use a broad brushstroke, effectively took the promises of the charter, the intentional statements, and made them into church law for the United States. You shall have a review board. So they became the you shall part of the this is what we intend to do. And the failure to observe these can result in canonical sanction. Now you'll notice on your screen it says essential norms for diocesan and eparchial policies. Eparchial is a term, eparchies refer to those geographical regions of the Eastern Rite. Let me just stay on essential norms for just a second. In fact, I want to go back to the Conference of Major Superiors of Men for just a moment, because you remember I said that the religious communities, Franciscans, Dominicans, Benedictines, all of them published a parallel document called Instruments of Hope and Healing that would be their statement of intent to protect children, youth, vulnerable adults. Now the bishops said that to effectively have accountability, that each year there would be an audit conducted by an outside firm. In practice, a third of the dioceses in the United States, I think there are 196 if I'm not mistaken, a third of them are actually visited by an independent auditing firm to ascertain whether those dioceses are in compliance with the charter. So it's an auditing process. The Secretariat here sees that is given over to the National Review Board. We review that, make recommendations to the bishops. That's the accountability piece. That's how the essential norms fit in. Now, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, to ensure their accountability, engaged a company called Presidium, which is a child care cradling agency. And in concert with Presidium, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men seek accreditation from this group according to 25 standards which they have articulated. And they can be divided into three main divisions: prevention, a response, and supervision. Although certainly incorporated in the standards are the principles of the charter. The Conference of Major Superiors of Men certainly realize that the charter and the norms apply to them. But the reason I want to make sure you understand the difference is that review boards will have a different responsibility than diocesan review boards, in that one of the practical repercussions of religious communities is they do not expel their members who have violated children. Let me put it this way, before you're ordained a Franciscan, you become a Franciscan. Before you become a Jesuit priest, you become a Jesuit. And so religious community priests are not expelled by their institutes, by their orders, if they violate. And so they're kept. And one of the mechanisms that is utilized, that they are on a safety plan then. And perhaps we could talk more about this later, but it has something to do with function of a diocesan review board. Let me go now quickly and just give a brief definition of, I want to get back to something for you on the screen. Let me move to review boards now. Definition, what is it? Well, basically, it's a consultative body. And its role is to assist the bishop, to accomplish accountability and transparency, to have some independent group that will be involved here specifically in the assessment of allegations. You'll notice that's one of the main tasks, to assess allegations. And Kate will talk about that process in just a moment. And in concert with assessing the allegation, to advise the bishop on the suitability of the priest for ministry. Incidentally, these same two tasks will be done by members of religious community review boards, just as diocesan review boards do this, although the religious community review board will inspect those safety plans, help create them, follow up on them. But for all review boards, assessment of allegations, suitability for ministry, and assessment of policy and procedures, the three main tasks. And we hope to spend the majority of the remaining time with us talking about those three tasks. But to repeat, definition, consultative body to assist the bishop, help the church achieve accountability, transparency in the processing of allegations.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So as Ernie said, the first role of a diocesan review board is to assess allegations. And so the first topic we're going to discuss is what is an allegation? And an allegation should be very broadly defined. It is not a smoking gun. It would be very unusual for there to be a witness to any inappropriate activity with a child. That is not within the dynamic of child sexual abuse. Instead, my suggestion would be is that any behavior that causes pause may result in an allegation. An allegation does not have to be supported by corroboration, as I said. Very rarely is there corroboration in any sexual abuse circumstance. Rumors may amount to an allegation in that rumor may lead to additional investigation, additional inquiry that may be very substantial in nature. One concern that I have is that allegations cannot be ignored simply because the person receiving the allegation knows the individual involved and believes that it simply isn't true. I think that's something that we all could struggle with, whether it's in our personal or our professional lives, that we hear an allegation about someone and we say to ourselves, oh, that simply can't be true. I know him. I know this isn't true. When, in fact, we all know of circumstances where those allegations were true. An allegation can include physical contact. It could include any form of touching. It may be text messaging, emailing, being alone with a child. It could be something that appears to be as innocuous as turning off your computer or turning off the screen whenever someone else enters the room. So very innocuous behavior or seemingly innocuous behavior can actually be something that could rise to the level of an allegation. The next concern, though, is who should take or receive allegations. And Article 2 of the Charter requires that each diocese have procedures for the making of any complaint or the reporting of any allegations. Those procedures are required by the Charter also to be understandable. That is, the procedures are such that anyone who observes, hears of something, is concerned about something, could easily understand his or her obligation or the means by which the reporting could take place. All of the allegations should be reported to a single entity within the diocese, a single person. Several years ago, the National Review Board did a study or a review of several circumstances that had occurred in dioceses where sexual abuse was taking place. And one of the failings that was common in each of those reports was that there was an inconsistency in to whom to report, how reports were made, and how reports were treated after they were made. And so the consistency of reporting being made to a single individual or office, and then the procedure for the reporting is very important. One suggestion is that, and we've discussed this at the National Review Board before, is that dioceses should have a hotline, perhaps an email opportunity for the anonymous reporting of concerns. Often, whether it's in the civil arena or if it is within the church, people are reluctant to make allegations because they're reluctant to either be involved in the allegation or the reporting, involved in the repercussions, or they're just not sure if the allegation is true, and then they're reluctant then to report something that could result in it being untrue. And so the ability to anonymously report is extremely important within the church.
Now, another key component of when we're talking about the allegation process too is really maintaining that confidentiality piece, which I think ties into what you're saying with having that direct process. Because really what we don't want to see happen is somebody to contact the wrong person with an allegation, that person tells 20 other people because they don't know what the process is. So that confidentiality piece is definitely important throughout the entire process.
Well, and that leads to my next point too, in that all staff in the diocese, whether it's at the school level, the church level, the diocesan level, should be properly trained and thoroughly trained in to whom to make the report, how to make the report, and the importance of confidentiality. Because the confidentiality piece, I think, is important in two respects. The first is, the respect afforded to the victim in keeping their identity confidential, because there's so many repercussions often for the victim, but also the confidentiality for the accused. If it is determined that the allegations lack merit, then that accused, pursuant to the charter, is entitled to have their reputation not protected and restored. And so you have that twofold concern for confidentiality. So all staff training is very important. And then as you alluded also, not only is confidentiality important, but also record keeping and keeping track of all allegations, because one allegation may, upon investigation, may not clearly demonstrate a cause for additional concern, but repeated allegations of a similar nature may eventually add up to very concerning behavior. So record keeping is important, and keeping those records in a central location in the diocese where confidentiality can be maintained. All allegations should be forwarded to the bishop. The bishop has a leadership role in many respects in the diocese, but one of those roles is to make very tough decisions about allegations that are made. And so, and also there are circumstances under which the bishop may find it necessary to take immediate action when an allegation is made prior to the completion of the investigation. And so the bishop needs to be involved immediately. The review board must also be involved immediately when an allegation is made, to assist in the process of the investigation, but also to assist the bishop in their consultative role in making decisions about the immediate suitability for ministry. One issue that cannot be emphasized enough, and that is the need to cooperate with civil authorities. Article 4 of the Charter makes very clear that cooperation with civil authorities, the reporting to civil authorities, must be strictly adhered to. Let the civil authorities do their job and undertake their function for child protection, but the church's role is to make those reports immediately to civil authorities. The Charter also requires the church and its staff to fully cooperate in any civil investigation.
And that piece really ties into the mandatory reporting as well, which goes along having that understanding and working with the civil authorities.
And mandatory reporting is different in every state in terms of who are mandatory reporters, but the trend is for states to broaden who are mandatory reporters. Some examples are social workers, attorneys, anyone in the medical field, anyone in the education field, that's just a very short version of who is a mandatory reporter. But the church has undertaken the position that even if someone is not a mandatory reporter, the church will report to civil authorities.
I hear the term ethical reporter in a lot of cases, and a lot of dioceses build that in, where it shouldn't matter whether it's the law for you specifically to report or not. We're doing this to protect the kids. It's everybody's responsibility.
Absolutely. The first step then in the investigative process upon receipt of an allegation will be for there to be a determination as to whether the allegation is manifestly false or frivolous. And this would be, if we likened this to a criminal proceeding, which it is not, but we could have some comparison, is that it is absolutely impossible for this to have occurred. And an example might be an alleged victim makes a claim that abuse occurred yesterday in the rectory, when in fact it is demonstrated by video recording that the alleged victim was at a hospital all day, and this could not possibly have occurred. And I think that there are rare circumstances when an allegation would be found to be manifestly false or frivolous. But if it is, then there is no further step in the process. If the allegation is not found to be manifestly false or frivolous, then the preliminary investigation occurs. It must be completed by an outside investigator. I couldn't be impartial with people that I know, people that I work with, maybe people that I trust. And so it is very important for the integrity of the investigation that the investigation take place by someone from the outside, because it's oftentimes the appearance of impartiality that is as important as the impartiality itself. An investigation done internally could be done impartially, but it could have a specter of partiality because it was done from within. The sixth essential norm requires that the investigation be done promptly and objectively, and therefore the need for an impartial investigation. While there is a presumption of innocence in the essential norms, nonetheless, a rigorous and vigorous investigation should take place. If there is sufficient evidence following consultation with the review board, then the bishop has an obligation to notify the congregation for the doctrine of faith. But obviously the bishop must proceed cautiously to make certain that a fair investigation has taken place, and by fair I mean thorough investigation. Following the completion of the investigation, the review board will consider the allegations and make their recommendation to the bishop. One of the issues that Howard and Ernie and I discussed this morning was the importance in any recommendation to protect the identity of the victim. And so if some written report is generated by the review board, that the victim's identity should be protected, because those documents could in the future be the subject to public disclosure, and the charter demands, as Ernie said earlier, that our foremost concern be given to the protection and healing of the victim. The second issue that the review board, function of the review board, is to assist the bishop in determining the suitability for ministry of clergy. And His Holiness John Paul II said, "There is no place in the priesthood or religious life for those who would harm the young." And so Article 2 of the Charter requires diocesan review boards to advise bishops of the suitability of ministry for clerics. Article 13 requires dioceses to employ adequate screening and evaluative techniques, but screening cannot be a mere background check or criminal check, because the statistics are that 80% of those who commit a sexual offense, and that would be a criminal offense, have no prior criminal history of sexual assault or sexual offending. And so a background check or a criminal background check is insufficient. Instead, there should be a thorough background check with neighbors, friends, social media, references, a personal interview, and then likely a psychological evaluation. One of the things that the Causes and Context study that was completed in 2011 revealed is that there is some correlation between offending and seminary study. And there's been a change, particularly in the last 10 years, in seminary study on human formation. And one of the questions that I think is important to ask when advising the bishop on the suitability of ministry is, when did the cleric attend the seminary? Was it prior to perhaps 1990, when human formation was not necessarily part of seminary study, or was it after human formation became an important part of seminary study? Quickly, though, I want to review boundary violations. The Charter at Article 6 indicates that there should be well publicized and clear diocesan standards for ministerial behavior, including boundary violations. There should be consistent policies and procedures on boundary violations, and this may be something that we can get to later if we have time to discuss that.
Okay, can I just ask
Sure.
you a question before you go on to assessment of policies and procedures? I want to go back to your really thorough description of once an allegation is received, the bishop is going to make an initial decision whether or not it has, sometimes the phrase is used, semblance of truth. If it does, then there's going to be an investigation. Give us your legal expertise here. My understanding is that often, and this has been my experience, there will be a police investigation during which the diocese will stop any of its investigative efforts so as not to interfere with the civil investigation. This would be the same for religious communities. I learned once in trying to assist a religious community, the civil authorities reported back to the provincial that, well, we don't have enough here. And the provincial wanted to restore the person to ministry and move on. And I was at a seminar last year, and the point was made that the police do not determine who are safe with children. And my question to you is, if that is the question that comes back, or that's the conclusion, we don't have enough to proceed, should not the diocese then conduct its own objective investigation because its criteria is going to be different at the review board level? The bishop's going to decide whether there's semblance of truth, and then the independent investigator will come back with a report, share with the review committee, who will decide on a different norm, that being the preponderance of evidence, perhaps make a recommendation to the bishop, this should go to Rome for the third phase of the process. Do I understand that correctly?
Sure. The civil authorities, or I'm going to call them criminal authorities, they are going to look for, is there sufficient evidence from which we could obtain a conviction? And the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. And police officers will tell you often, there's something there, we have evidence, we don't have enough to obtain a conviction, therefore we will not proceed with a more thorough criminal investigation. But that doesn't mean that the church's investigation should accept, or the church should accept the civil authorities' investigation, because they're going to stop when there isn't sufficient evidence to obtain a criminal conviction. And the standard for review boards and for the bishop should be a preponderance of the evidence. That is simply the greater weight of the evidence, that it is more likely true than not. And that, I think people often confuse or suggest that we have to have enough evidence to meet a criminal standard which should not be the case. Our concern is protection of children, not whether there's some determination of guilt or innocence. So there should not be the confusion of those two standards.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk about boundary violations. In many abuse cases, there's grooming activities going on. And some of those activities come to light with boundary violations. So I think as a group, we can't emphasize enough how important investigating boundary violations and avoid saying, this isn't that important. Let's just, next time maybe. Every single allegation that we have should be investigated, and boundary violations sometimes stop abuse because you don't get to that point, and the grooming stops, and you can prevent abuse.
I think it's also important, though, to point out, though, that a boundary violation can be the signal of the abuse that is occurring in private. So that conduct that someone is willing to engage in, whether it's touching, whether it's people knowing that they're alone with the child, may appear to be some boundary violation, but it is the signal that other conduct could be occurring. So.
Great points about boundary violations, especially because, like you said, Kate, that's often maybe all we'll see, but what else is going on? Plus, it could be, like you said, Howard, a precursor to abuse as part of the grooming process.
Like an iceberg.
Exactly. Yeah, this is what we see. What else is going on? And on the opposite side, even if it's not either of those, it hasn't risen to that level yet, it's still a violation of policy of what our procedures are. There's a gap somewhere, and we need to address it on both sides. So absolutely key in identifying these boundary violations early on. Now, I know in some dioceses, because of maybe just their amount of allegations or what they're working with still from their past history, they may not be able to adequately address the boundary violations that are happening as a review board. But we've seen in some of these dioceses, they may have a separate advisory group that can take on those boundary violations, or that are looking at the boundary violations by the laity. So maybe if your review board can take on any clergy boundary violations, is there another group that can look at laity, so we can protect kids from all of those angles?
But I think that's a good segue to the next topic, which is the assessment of policies and procedures. And with adequate policies and procedures, you can have a document that all employees, whether they're lay or clergy, will understand these are acceptable behaviors, these are not acceptable behaviors, and they can often cover issues that could be boundary violations. But as Ernie mentioned, the second role of review boards is to assess the policies and procedures of the diocese. And those assessments should take place periodically. They should be, we discussed this morning what type of schedule they should be on. For instance, the Archdiocese of Cincinnati does a complete review of its policies and procedures by the review board every 5 years. We just completed that process. But it may be that 2 years could be appropriate. It may be that policies, and it's likely should be, policies should be reviewed as something occurs. And I think this gets back to the HRO, or the high reliability organization principles. When there is a failure, there should be a reaction that, again, it may relate to policies and procedures.
Okay, I think
Sure.
this is perhaps what you made me think of when you were talking about this as a main task of the review boards, is I referred to earlier to the norms that the legislative piece and the audit that the dioceses undergo. One of the ways the auditing company sees that the charter is being implemented is to go back and see if the diocese has policies in place. And this is a crucial role that the review board can play to see if the policies really carry out the charter. Is there a victim assistance coordinator? Does the review board meet? Is there policies and procedures relative to background screening? And really the point I'm trying to get to is I think the three of us have strong feelings about parish audits, school audits in dioceses. That's kind of where the action is. A diocese can be audited and the policies are in place, but are the policies taking place in the locations where abuse has traditionally happened, in the rectory or in a parish setting or in a school setting. So I like to take this opportunity for us to nurture and to encourage the idea of review boards saying in their dioceses, are we having school audits? Are we having parish audits? Are they part of the process? And there can be a number of ways for those to be carried out. But I think that's a crucial step.
And that is a position that the National Review Board has taken, the recommendation that there be parish and school audits as part of the auditing process.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. So, and let's just talk so we can make sure we get to Howard. In addition, the review boards should periodically review the safe environment training, and that, quite frankly, could be an entirely different webinar on its own, safe environment training. But some things that the review boards could look at is whether all of the persons who are required to undergo safe environment training are actually completing the training. Is the training effective? Is there some deficiency in the training in terms of content or how often the training is completed? And again, I think the staff at the parish or school level must be aware of the policies and procedures. For instance, in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, we just completed our review. Part of that process was our discussion about, are staff members going to be required to acknowledge receipt of the new policies? And is there going to be any training for staff on policies and anything that's new? One last thing I'd like to say is that change comes often through a change in culture. And if we as a diocese accept the importance of the charter, which I firmly believe that all the dioceses do, as long as we adhere to the policies, we embrace the policies, we find them to be important, then we will have culture change. Howard?
That's the perfect key component of what we're looking for with all of this, right? From the charter, the essential norms, our review boards, everything under child protection is that change in culture to promote that protection of, or that culture of safety, really, which all ties back to the charter and what we're trying to do. And you mentioned the principles of high reliability organizations earlier too. That's another task that the review board can even take under, which relates to maintaining the policies and procedures, and really taking a look at that is, how is our culture looking as a diocese? Can we as a review board make any recommendations to continue to enhance that culture? Well,
that's a key point, especially because I think one of the things is we cannot fall into complacency. You know, we've mentioned the audit. Is the audit just a checklist we go through, we passed, or is it seen as a blueprint to help continue to create a culture of safety and to ward off complacency?
Absolutely.
In the interest of full disclosure, I should tell you that I've been a chairman of our board for 15 years, and my wife just retired as a 15-year principal at a Catholic grade school in Neenah, Wisconsin. So she's given me the other side of the equation, how the audit works from the reporting parts from the schools. In 15 years, I've worked for 3 bishops and many, many exceptional people who've answered God's call to advise bishops and fulfill the commitment of the church to protect children and vulnerable adults. All 3 of us have lots of board experience, and this outline is our attempt to share our thoughts. I'll be getting into it, but it's important to understand we're not telling you what to do. When you make these choices, it's important to look at the people on your board, your bishop, and find a model that works for you. I'll be emphasizing some specific principles. As the first principle on the graphics shows, strive for a diverse board. Now that means more than just having gender diversity and ethnicity. It really talks about having members that have a variety of experience and skill to bring to the board. For example, the charter requires that there be a pastor and one member with child protection experience. But that's it. The charter requires that 5 of the members be in good standing in the church. But beyond that, it's a matter of giving the skills and looking what the task of the board is, to advise the bishop, give the bishop expert advice that he would otherwise not necessarily get from a variety of members. Most in the varsity, most members have terms. For example, at the end of the terms, it's important to take a look at who's leaving the board and try and balance some of the skills. Of course, you need lawyers, but not too many. And you need teachers, and you need investigators, and you need physicians or psychiatrists, or really anybody who exercises good judgment and is willing to educate themselves and learn about what's going on with the process. That's part of what you can see on this slide. The second point is talk to other members. Now, I think we all know that people love to be asked their opinion. And can you help me with this? Can I have your opinion? And don't be afraid, ask them. The people on the board are all good people, and it's almost an indirect mentoring situation. I actually believe that there should be a formal mentoring situation or orientation process, which you can see is on the bottom of the slide. But it's important for new members to figure out what's going on, to educate themselves, and because the stuff that's going on is important. And it's important to take time for the new members, and as Kate was saying, review the material for the audit. Now, for example, many dioceses receive what's called a management letter from the auditor. And the management letter talks about practices. You pass the audit, but maybe you want to take a little bit, think about this and think about that. And review boards should be getting a copy of that. And that's a time when you look at the audit letter, say, we have to look at this policy or that policy. So, and in our diocese, we look at the policies every year and try to have a more comprehensive review every, say, 5 years or so. But once again, the next one, you have to take a look at the charter. Take what these causes and context study. Educate yourself. It's important for a member to know, why did the church get here? What happened? What has the church been doing since the crisis? And it's important to understand the answer is quite a lot. The church is probably the one organization in the country, because other organizations have the same problems. We know that from the newspapers and our other reports. But the church is doing more, in my judgment, not just parish audits and audits, but virtuous training and all kinds of other volunteers, all kinds of things that we're leading the way in protecting the children, many of these things. The diocesan policies and procedures, that's really two separate things. You've got the diocesan policies, and I think we're all suggesting your job is to fix them if necessary, but you can't fix them if you don't know them. So it's important for both new and old board members to look at what's out there. And from time to time, review the policies, and certainly when you're starting out, sit down with another board member and take a look at the policies. The policies of the review board are different. And once again, it's not something that has to be the same everywhere. In terms of that, I recommend that you have written policies. That's the better practice. But sometimes there's procedures. For example, you have different types of allegations. You have a third-party allegation for a situation where my brother is deceased now, but he was 20 years ago, he was at this place or this school, and he was abused. And there's no victim alive, there's a victim. And then, as opposed to somebody saying, when I was at this parish, Father such and such was involved, and I can tell you today what the wallpaper looked like upstairs. That's a serious situation. And in my board, and I think the three of us agree, there's a few simple things that are necessary. One, report everything. Even if you don't think it's give you the frivolous, there's a whole lot of things in the middle, not just boundary, but report everything. And the review board should be in the middle and be at every step of the process, as Ernie was talking about. And that's because a properly constructed review board gives the bishop the expert advice that the bishop needs.
Just to highlight again on that, Howard, the importance of every single thing going to the review board. In a lot of cases where we've had dioceses that have had maybe some major issues come to light post-charter, when the review board was already in place, upon investigation into how that happened, one of the result causes tended to be because the review board wasn't given the information, or wasn't given all of the information, it was funneled. So we've seen that recently, even within the past 16 years, that if the review board isn't given all the information, that's when you can have more problems.
But if the review board doesn't meet, the review board doesn't get information. And so
Good point.
the review board must meet, and whether it's a minimum of once a year, twice a year, but the review board must meet, or it can't engage in the function of reviewing policies and procedures, et cetera. So there must be review board meetings.
Mm-hmm. And the role of the review board has been expanding. Bishops are saying boundary violations, things in schools, and sometimes the bishop is just asking for some advice. I can recall meetings where I'll say, okay, everybody talks, nobody hides, everybody gives their opinion on this particular point, go around the room. And our bishop likes that, because I think I'll be getting into it in a minute, but that is a familiarization, educational process that I think is helpful, because these things are going to come up again. And knowing opinions, getting advice, you can plan for stopping these things from happening. Mm-hmm. I talked about orientation. What you can expect from the diocese. Support, documents, administrative assistance, and the opportunity to serve the church in a way that the church needs, that helps the church to work with some of the best people you'll ever meet in the world. That's what happens when you take on board experience. And the last point, know what you do. If you read the other points, I don't have to go into that. Okay, the next thing is do's and don'ts. Do's and don'ts slide, thank you, are simple in a way. They're all common sense things. Now, there's some stuff that's very particular to review boards, like the one do and the don't. There's never, ever, ever, ever a reason for anybody on a review board to talk to the media. There can't be any excuse or justification or any reason. I get requests from time to time. They all get referred to the appropriate person in the diocese. So it's just our role of our boards is to advise the bishop. So talking to somebody else, and it's also confidential, and there's no reason for any individual member to give their individual opinion, because the board acts collectively as a group. So if you remember anything from today, understand there's no talking to outside people. And you sign a confidentiality agreement too. Okay, so then there's the information. I've talked about this, so I won't spend much time on it. Read things that are available. You should refocus and watch our webinar at least 10 times. So then you'll have a sense of what's going on. There are things, so you have the importance of the parish audits that's been covered. And there's some reports, various annual reports. Take the time to read that. A lot of people spend a whole lot of time comparing it. It gives you a balance of what's going on. I'll deny saying this, I guess I can't, but it's like a report card for the church. We shouldn't be afraid as church to see how are we doing, what's going on, and identify areas to improve. So on the don't side, I think I've covered most of it. Victims. If victims call you, they shouldn't have your information, but sometimes our names get out, and there's never a situation where you want to talk to a victim. One, you don't have all the information. Two, you're not an expert. And three, it's way outside your role, regardless how many good things you want to do, how you want to help. We exist to advise the bishops, not to provide therapy or help to victims. If you do get a call from a victim, simple, call the diocese, explain what happened, and let the experts take care of what's going on.
Howard, do you mind though talking about the point of encouraging your diocese to be as transparent as possible regarding chartered priests? Because I think that information is so important to
Thank you.
to parishioners' confidence in the church.
There's a crisis in our church. A crisis about, what's going on? And can we trust what's being done? And transparent is a different word in different places in the country. But transparent to me means you just open it up. We've said it. Report everything to the authorities. And while you're doing that, report any claims to the authorities first and notify the priest second. Cooperate, yes, but everything should be out in the open. If you have documents, disclose no documents or all the documents. So Kate's point is open. If we're open and we tell the truth, if you'll tell the truth, you're going to be okay. Maybe you have some bad press for a while, anything like that, but that doesn't matter because being transparent, explaining what's going on, the goal is to protect children. Anything that protects the children is a goal that should be followed. And transparency is something, there's never any reason to hide anything.
Can I interject
Sure.
one point, and that is, you just mentioned, tell the civil authorities first and the priest second. And I would recommend exercising caution about when anyone who is accused of an allegation, anyone, whether it's a layperson, a member of the clergy, when they're advised. I think that consultation should come with the police or your outside investigator, because investigations are often compromised by the accused being told too early on in the process that they are a target of an investigation and evidence disappears, et cetera. So I would just strongly recommend and encourage that you talk with experts in terms of timing of discussing things with someone who's been accused.
I agree. And early on at the board, we decided that it was important to make sure that the authorities, police, you got the knock on the door and the questions. And that happens rather than use the phrase lawyer up. I don't mean that in a negative way, but we're here to protect children and make sure that people in ministry are not engaged in inappropriate activities. That's part of the whole process, yes?
I agree.
Okay, then next slide. Thank you. This is a very important matter for what boards do. And I want to go to the second bulletin point first. Understand that we're telling you this is not like a baseball cap where one size fits all. And there's many, many different ways of doing it. And I want to focus on the role of the bishop first. There's two major models out there, and they're both legitimate. One model, the bishop does not attend the meetings, and there's a more formal process of correspondence back and forth and a written recommendation, usually a vote back and forth. This is a very, very acceptable and appropriate model. It's a formal model, and it's one that is directed, in my judgment, as making sure there's no compromise to the independence of the board. There are concerns that the bishop may steer the board or make his ideas known or direct the board. The second model is the model that we have actually followed in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and our bishop, all three of the bishops, attended the board meetings, but I chaired them, and I made a deal with each one of the bishops before I accepted my continuing role as chair that I was going to run the meetings, and he was there to listen and ask questions. It's a little overpowering to make a rule for a bishop. I don't do that very often, but it was important to me to have an agreement that would be understood that we had different roles. You know, we're not like the government. We're here to help, but excuse me, I shouldn't have said Washington, but we were having an interactive process, if you will, and so neither the bishop in our diocese or his top administrative people or the diocesan attorney would break in and attempt to direct the board at all. And when we deliberate, our process was to build a consensus. And it's challenging sometimes to build a consensus from the law enforcement point of view and the therapist point of view, or the pastor. Everybody's contributing with their expertise. That's what makes what the final product so worthwhile. It's concerning the effort. But in 15 years, we've never taken a vote, and the board runs the agenda, and board has the discussion, and so this is not good or bad. My wife told me one time that difficult choices in life are sometimes choosing between two goods. So these are all good choices. I encourage you to remember to make it independent. That's really what's important. And if you have people are deliberating in good faith and willing to listen to the other people in the room, you're usually going to get the right answer, whether or not the bishop's there. Then we have a thorough investigation. I'm not going to. Kate talked about that, and I would echo what she said. It's important. You have to get the facts. That's what's important here. You want facts, not emotion, not opinions, not reputation. You want the facts presented to the board in a dispassionate way that gets the right result, and make sure that if the abuse occurred, we face up to it as church, and we do the right thing. And there's different things, and the bishop makes the final decision. But I've not kept a scorecard. I really have. Our bishops, all three of them, never ever failed to follow a recommendation of our board in 15 years. So it can work. And I think all those decisions are right. I wouldn't second guess of any one of them. So then you utilize the methods. I think that's repetitive. So, the norm. This one says probable cause. We said, what was the other one we said before?
Preponderance of the evidence.
That's really the same thing. The lawyers can argue with me, but probable cause means more probable than not. And I want to emphasize again, it's not criminal. The civil authorities do their process. This is it probable or not that the abuse occurred? We're in the business of protecting children. That's what's important. Ernie, out of time? No. Ernie talked about complacency. Some people believe that the instances of abuse are down. That doesn't matter. One is too many. And if you're becoming complacent as church, let somebody else do it. Civility in deliberations. Everybody on every board I've worked on has a point of view, but it's not, they're also listening. So civility involves sharing your thoughts, listening to other thoughts, and trying to come to an agreement that everybody can say, yes, this is fair. Okay.
Definitely a lot of great points for people to think about, I think, on that past one too, particularly when we're looking at the transparency piece, and also, I mean, there's everything else the board should be doing, and when we're looking at those all of those cases that come through. So great points, Howard.
I think there's a slide I'm trying to locate. Hold on a second. Well, maybe it's not there this morning. Oh, here it is. Review boards of religious communities. Let me just do this very briefly because I think there are some questions that we need to give you the opportunity to ask. But safety plans and presidium standards. I was chair of the Joliet Diocese Review Board for 10 years, completed those terms. Not once did I have to deal with safety plans. Now in my service to 4 different religious communities on their review boards, this is the predominant thing we do. Because you'll recall that I mentioned that religious communities keep their members. And an obligation that follows from that is to supervise them, to put them on a safety plan. And Presidium, in its standards, you'll recall I mentioned religious communities ensure or try to show their accountability by getting accredited through the Presidium organization. There is a template and for safety plans, how they are created, and this will be one of your main responsibilities along with reviewing them every year. Let me talk about a couple of unique things about serving a religious community. One might be to assist that community in observing the standards, in helping them achieve accreditation, in being prepared for their accrediting business, their accrediting visit. Also, religious communities, by and large, have specified terms for their superiors. It's not like a bishop who is ordained to be a bishop and he's going to be a bishop for a number of years. A superior might be elected for 3 years and then not elected by the community. And it's not rare for a new superior to come in and say to the review board, I'm very new at this business of child protection. This hasn't been my background. Can you help me? And the review board is almost called upon to be a mentoring role. Additionally, while the members of religious communities certainly acknowledge that the charter and the norms are primary, because of the burden of the accrediting experience, certainly many look to that primarily, and the promises of the charter are encapsulated in the Presidium standards. But there is, I can think of one example, a notable topic that is not included in the standards. There is no prohibition of asking a victim for a confidentiality agreement, which is very clear in the charter, and a diocese can be found to be not compliant if it asks or insists upon a confidentiality agreement. That is just has the potential to be very harmful for a victim, re-victimize the person. So another role of the safety of the review board of a religious community is to make sure that the charter and the norms, those things are primary, and to call the superior's attention to that. Additionally, on occasion, my experience has been that a particular religious superior might come to the conclusion that, well, we have it down now, and we'll take care of this, and we'll call the review board in kind of at the end. This is not good practice, and it certainly omits the step that should be taken, if for no other reason that to ensure accountability and transparency. And in these instances, my position on that is the review board should be assertive. If the review board's not meeting, as Kate mentioned, you call the superior, calls attention to the fact that they should meet once a year. Go over some of the standards, review the policies, but make sure it meets. And I think the same thing could be said of diocesan review boards. And I think there's 2 primary roles of the chair, being it's a diocesan review board or a religious community review board. Number 1 is to maintain the independence of the review board. Howard alluded to that. The bishop wants to come and sit in, that's fine, but the review board chair must be strong in safeguarding the independence of the review board. That can be accomplished in something as simple as how to arrange the chairs at a meeting. The board sits here and the other folks sit on the periphery, so to speak. A second main responsibility of the chair is to make sure the review board meets, at least annually. There is plenty to do.
I'd add to that two things, actually. It's your job as the chair to make sure things are fair and done the right way. And talking about the safety plans, one of the emerging areas, I think, is we're not recognizing that not all priests are removed from the religious state. Some of them have prayer and penance for life. And this has created some challenges for the review board. I believe the review board should be involved in setting policies at the policy level and practices, procedures to safety plans, or if the priest is still in the diocese has an obligation to make sure children are safe. And that's part of that's, I think, something that's emerging, like some boundary issues. So that's something to look for.
A lot of that really pertains to knowing what your policies and procedures are and maintaining that consistency throughout the process.
Or having one.
Exactly, exactly.
One of the things that the National Review Board has spent a great deal of time on in the past couple of years is developing a resource toolbox with the assistance of the staff and the members of the audit committee, particularly under the leadership of Laura Rogers. And this toolbox is an online community that provides resources, whether it's policies, procedures, definitions, and there are items of interest for safe environment coordinators, victim assistance coordinators, diocesan attorneys, diocesan review boards, and that toolbox is constantly being updated. Everything in that toolbox has been vetted in terms of compliance with the charter or compliance with the norms. As I said, it took several years to compile, so there was a great deal of effort that went into providing these resources for people in the diocese. If you have policies that you believe would be of assistance to others, you could send those to the staff, and we can review those, or whether it's the staff or the National Review Board, for inclusion in the toolbox. In addition, there is a closed community within the USCCB's website where you can ask questions of your peers. Only those within this closed community, that would be SECs, VACs, and Diocesan Review Board members, would have access to that, but it is a great resource to talk with your peers about concerns that you may have. Obviously, as review board members, you may also want to talk with the canon lawyer in your diocese, or the safe environment coordinator, or the victim assistance coordinator, for information that may be helpful in your consultative role to the bishop.
Kate, you made me think of something that both of you know I'm pledged to. And that has to do with definitions within your policies. There is, in the resource toolbox, wonderful examples of diocesan policies and wonderful examples of definitions. And if you'll pardon me, I want to take a minute to talk about a particular definition, and that is the definition of a vulnerable adult. I have a 48-year-old son with cerebral palsy, a wonderful man who has faced life with courage and dignity in spite of his disabilities. And the canonical definition of vulnerable adult is a person who habitually lacks the use of reason. I accept that with respect, but that doesn't define or describe my son or all those persons with developmental disabilities I've met over the years. May I suggest to you, as you review your policies, that you add to the canonical definition something more humane and personal. For example, a vulnerable adult might be described as one who, because of physical and developmental disability, cannot protect themselves from self-abuse. Thank you. I feel strongly about this specific and particular issue.
But Ernie, you and I have talked about this a long time, because I too have an adult son who has cerebral palsy, and the definition of a vulnerable adult, I'll be honest, I find offensive. It does not consider that there are adults who have all of their reasoning faculties but cannot physically protect themselves. And so that definition of vulnerable adult, while it is a canonical definition that requires a great deal of effort to change, that doesn't mean that dioceses must accept that, again, offensive definition. It's a dehumanizing definition, and they can expand their definition of a vulnerable adult to not only be sensitive, but also be practical and recognize that physical disability may render you much more vulnerable in circumstances.
Now, this ties back to, I think, what we mentioned in the beginning, that the charter and really then canon law as well as being the foundation. So dioceses, of course, can continue to build upon that, whether that's definitions they have, their policies, procedures, everything about how they run the review board. And I know we've had a lot of questions come in from folks, so I want to get to those. Real quick, we've mentioned canon law a couple of times as well. We do have a webinar available specifically that talks about canon law and how it pertains to the charter. That's on the Secretariat's website. So if you want to get in a little bit more of that, feel free to take a look at that webinar. So some of the questions that we've been getting, Kate, you mentioned prompt reporting to the civil authorities. Should this be after the review board has initially determined that the allegation is not frivolous or suspicious?
The mandatory reporting laws, and I'm going to talk about the mandatory laws as opposed to sort of the permissive reporting laws, demand immediate reporting and that there be no assessment of the allegations. So even if you feel there is absolutely no merit, it's not possible, the law requires that civil authorities be notified.
So whether somebody thinks it's frivolous, not, doesn't matter.
Correct.
Should be reported.
The question is, what if somebody is abused in the interim before the time you get the report and you report it? That's the reason.
Great points. Thank you for that one. So another question that we got, one review board recently discussed publicizing names of all the accused clerics in their diocese, but their judicial vicar informed them of a pontifical secret rule that seemed to shut it down. So how would you recommend they implement openness and transparency while adhering to this pontifical secret?
We can recommend, but I don't believe that the review board should be involved in that type of activity. We can recommend to the bishop, we think this should go, but the bishop makes the decisions. That's my sense of it.
I will tell you that the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and I obviously was not involved in the decision, but has on its website the name of each priest that has been removed from the clerical state or what the circumstance of the investigation was. And I find that comforting as a parishioner in the Archdiocese because I can protect, those that I'm able to protect, whether it's my family or loved ones.
The Diocese of Joliet has names on its website, and the bishop, one of his strengths is canon law. So I don't know if this is a particular interpretation of the pontifical statement, but many dioceses do that. And I think it's a step toward trying to show the faithful we're being transparent.
I think it's a great idea. We have registries for sex offenders, so it's consistent with that, but I still believe the bishop should make that decision, and the board should stay within its role.
I would caution, though, anyone from assuming that simply because someone isn't on a sex offender registry or they are not on a list available on a website or something, that they let down their guard. Because, as I said before, the evidence is very clear from a great deal of research that, as I said, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% of people who are convicted of offending have no prior convictions. The number may be higher. That's a number that I'm recalling from my own past research, but you can't be complacent simply because someone isn't on a list.
And we know how much sexual abuse especially is so underreported.
Absolutely.
That this goes back to why you may have somebody who has multiple victims but nobody's reported it. And so they're going to pass a background check.
Depending on the source. The underreporting is anywhere between 60 and 90%, just depending on the source that you're utilizing.
Absolutely. So going back to what you were mentioning as far as dioceses still publicizing names, you're right, it's ultimately up to the bishop. And we see a lot of dioceses do that. One of the key factors, though, is that they're publicizing the list of accused clergy where it's been deemed credible and substantiated. So they're not necessarily listing, every single allegation that came through, but it's what's gone through the investigation, what's been deemed appropriate that they want to be transparent
Right.
about that. So great points that you brought up on that.
Well, if they've been removed from his ministry, that's a
Exactly.
easy way to decide who's on the list and who's not.
Absolutely. And in most cases, even if it's not a separate list, the information's going to be out there because it's public record. So it's still out there in the public, so why not be transparent about it and put it on your own website and own up to, this is what our history is, but we're letting everybody know. Great points. So Kate, again, going back to preliminary investigations, should this be done by an outside party? Is this specifically stated in the essential norms?
Do you want to answer?
I don't believe it is. Our expert on norms said, if I get it wrong, Ernie, jump in. But this is a matter of the better way to do it. There's not a requirement to do that, but Kate said, you have the independent, and we don't do a very good job of I know Father Jones. I was in his parish 20 years ago. It was never happened. We can't do that. That's not our charge. Our charge is to protect children and make sure the allegations are reported. So somebody that's not in some dioceses, to be honest, that had a gatekeeper with allegations, and some were reported, some were not. So I don't think we can go back to that. And I'm a firm believer that that's the much better way to do things.
Well, and the sixth essential norm does say a prompt and objective investigation must be completed. And I think objective or an objectively completed investigation requires an outside investigator. You cannot be objective, again, if it's somebody that you know, or if you have a stake in the outcome. So I would say yes, that preliminary investigation under the sixth essential norm should be.
I think we all agree with that.
After all the church has been through and all that it has done to try and advance safe environments, to not have an independent investigation just doesn't really make sense to me.
Well, and we were talking this morning that sometimes, and I don't want there to be a misinterpretation of what I'm saying, but the cover-up is worse than the crime. And you think about Richard Nixon. You know, be honest, be forthcoming, and the repercussions it may not be as severe. But if you try to hide things, if you're not objective, if you're not transparent, then the investigation and its shortcomings take precedence over the actual investigation.
You know, one of the challenges is to recover the confidence of the faithful.
And also, it's just smart. If, from a legal perspective, you can say, Bishop, why did you do that in this case, not in this case? Can you explain that? In the case you didn't do it, the child was abused. Now, if you did it in this case, you answer that. I mean, so it's just smart and reasonable, and I think Kate's right. It doesn't say outside, but you can really read it that way. It should.
So it really ties into adding to the credibility is what you mentioned as well, as far as keeping it external. And then I also think allows the review board members to be more objective with the whole scenario, because they're not the ones doing the investigation. They're getting the results and then can analyze it and talk about it as a body. Wonderful. Now, when is an investigation not just preliminary?
Well, I think that the first thing that I would say is a preliminary doesn't mean surface. I think I would suggest sometimes preliminary means primary. It's got to be thorough, it's got to be complete. Those are the two things that I think need to be kept in mind, because the bishop, in presenting allowing the review committee to see the report of the independent investigator, the review board's going to make a decision whether or not there's a preponderance of evidence that an allegation has merit. And then it'll be sent to Rome with the bishop's votum. And that term means, Bishop, do you think it happened? And so if there's not a full investigation, he's sending it to Rome without full facts. So that's the thing I stress about people who say, what's this preliminary business? Sometimes I wonder if that term is really helpful.
Well, and I think that is a misidentification, because if you look at that initial investigation, as Ernie said, it's thorough and complete, so it's not preliminary. Perhaps the term preliminary is because when it goes to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, that they too may complete an investigation. But preliminary should not mean cursory, it should not mean partial, it should be, again, as the essential norms require, prompt, objective, complete.
It's probably a
That's
better
helpful,
word is
Kate.
assessment. You get a charge in. There's already somebody's done something, okay? But once the preliminary assessment is, does this priest stay in ministry? That's got to be, you can't wait till down the line. So I think that the language could be improved. It's an ongoing investigation that starts when you get a allegation.
And isn't our experience that it would be rare that a priest who has an accusation lodged would be kept in ministry during the period of investigation? Temporarily removed from ministry, isn't that your best practice?
You know, I've talked to priests, and you can honestly say, and that I think sometimes the priests think that the boards are out to get them, and that they're not treating fairly because they're assumed to be guilty when there's an allegation made. Now, I'm not talking about this particular case, but the overriding factor is protecting the child, and there's a credible allegation, I shouldn't say it, an allegation that's not outside the boundaries described today, that almost always results in a ministry exclusion temporarily.
Here we take teachers out of the classroom, for example, while something is investigated. But I just wanted to highlight that point of a priest being removed from ministry immediately, maybe not permanently, depending on the outcome of things. But
So speaking of the investigations, who would be qualified as a third-party investigator? So for instance, would you recommend a retired law enforcement officer, a private investigator?
I think it has to be somebody that is familiar with the church, familiar with appropriate investigative techniques. So retired law enforcement, I think you have to be careful with private investigators because their credentials may not be comparable to law enforcement. My preference would be retired law enforcement and someone who in their law enforcement career had experience with dealing with victims of sexual abuse and perpetrators, because there is such a particular dynamic that the investigative procedures and techniques are much different than in, for instance, a theft case or that type of thing. So,
Almost always former police or current police, if they can get one, or sheriff's investigator from the DA's office, something like that. We have a former board member who's not a coordinator. He's retired police. He's terrific, but they're trained. They're professionally trained, and they've passed background and all kinds of tests. So they're the best source. This is what they did. So we should use the best and the well-trained people, not just get somebody whose Uncle Charlie is a PI and something like that. So yes,
but
you're
someone
right.
who has training though in the forensic interview of a victim, because you don't want to re-victimize by whether it's poor interviewing techniques or inappropriate interviewing techniques, and so that particular skill set I think is so important to meeting the Charter's expectations of your sensitivity to your victim also.
Mm-hmm. And all of this with the investigation process and pretty much everything that we've talked about today really all falls under what does your diocesan policy say in relation to investigations, to review boards, and let's make sure we're following the same policies and being consistent in what we're doing. Absolutely. Well, we're coming to the end of our time today. So real quick, if I could ask each one of you, if you have one quick takeaway from today, what would that be?
I would offer to persons who are with us today that this is a real opportunity to engage in a noble task, to help church, to help the country, and to protect children. It's an opportunity. Step forward.
Wonderful, thank you.
I would say be courageous in your recommendations to your bishop, particularly when it comes to things like parish audits and school audits. Don't be afraid to say what's important to keep with the goal of protecting children.
Kate, you stole my thunder.
Sorry.
That's okay. The phrase often repeated, most often in the Bible, is what? Be not afraid. Okay, do that. Do the right thing. Don't be afraid to do the right thing, and trust your colleagues, and then recognize that this is holy work we're doing. That's what I think it is. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us today, for sharing your expertise, your guidance on all things review boards, basically. I think this is going to be very helpful information for folks that are on review boards, but also that are involved in child protection in another way to really learn from that and continue to build on their review board as well. To those of you that are watching us, thank you again so much for your participation in the webinar. In case you missed anything, or if you want to share this webinar with a colleague, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Secretariat's website soon. And just want to take a moment to thank you for all that you do to bring healing to those who have been abused and to ensure accountability and transparency within your diocese. You heard that as a key theme throughout today's webinar. And really just thank you for working tirelessly to protect children and the vulnerable from abuse and other harm, because that's the key to all of this. That's why you have a review board. That's why you're within your diocese doing what you do. So thank you for everything, for creating cultures of protection and healing, and God bless. Until next time.